The wind across the sun-scorched mesas carried the scent of death. It was a dry, metallic odor that clung to the back of the throat, a mixture of spent gunpowder, spilled blood, and the oppressive dust of the Redemption Valley. Marshal Jake Rawlins felt it before he saw it, a cold premonition that settled deep in his gut. He spurred his horse Dust Devil onward, the animal's hooves kicking up clouds of ochre earth that painted the air in strokes of grim anticipation. The scene when he crested the final rise was one of violent stillness. The overland stagecoach lay on its side like a slaughtered beast, its wheels pointing uselessly at the indifferent blue sky. Splintered wood fanned out from the chassis, and the once proud crimson paint was scarred with bullet holes. The horses were gone, cut loose from their harnesses. The driver and the shotgun guard lay sprawled in unnatural poses, their life stories ending abruptly in the dirt. Jake dismounted his boots, crunching on shattered glass. The silence was the worst part. It was a heavy, profound quiet that had swallowed the echoes of rifle cracks and panicked screams. He moved through the wreckage with the practiced economy of a man all too familiar with such aftermaths. His deputy, a young, eager man named Miller, was already there, his face pale and his hands unsteady as he catalogued the grim details. Marshal Miller said, his voice barely a whisper, "It's bad. They took the strongbox, of course. Didn't leave anyone alive." Jake's gaze swept over the victims. 4 passengers, men in city clothes, whose business in redemption would forever remain unfinished. He felt a familiar hollow ache. It was the same ache he carried every day, a constant companion since the morning he'd found his wife Sarah at the bottom of the rocky ravine behind their home. A riding accident, the doctor had said. A terrible, senseless tragedy. For a year, that single event had defined him, hollowing him out, until all that remained was the rigid discipline of his duty. He knelt beside the last of the bodies, a homesteader family. The man and woman lay side by side, their hands still reaching for each other in a final futile gesture. Their young son was curled between them. It was a tableau of innocence savaged, and it made the cold ache in Jake's chest sharpen into a blade. The father's hand was clenched tight. Jake gently pried the man's fingers open. Lying in the dead man's palm was a small, intricately engraved silver locket. Time seemed to stop. The oppressive heat, the distant cry of a hawk, the buzzing of flies, it all faded into a roaring silence in Jake's ears. His own hand, calloused and steady, trembled as he reached for it. The locket was oval with delicate filigree work of vines and roses spiraling around its edge. He knew every curve, every tiny imperfection in the silver. He had given an identical locket to Sarah on their first anniversary. His thumb found the almost invisible clasp, a motion his fingers remembered with an intimacy that was now agonizing. He pressed it. The locket sprang open. On one side was a miniature portrait of a younger, smiling Jake. On the other, a space for a lock of hair. Empty. "Marshal, are you all right?" Miller's voice sounded as if it were coming from a great distance. Jake didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind was a maelstrom of impossibility. The locket had been Sarah's most prized possession. She was never without it. He had buried it with her himself, placing it in her cold hands before the casket was sealed. It was resting beneath 6 feet of redemption soil on a quiet hill overlooking the town. It could not be here, not in the hand of a dead stranger. The world rushed back in a dizzying wave. The heat was suffocating. The smell of death was overwhelming. This wasn't just another robbery. This wasn't the work of common bandits driven by greed. The presence of this locket was a message of violation that reached back in time to desecrate his most sacred memory. Someone had not only committed this atrocity, but had deliberately orchestrated this moment to torment him. They had reached into Sarah's grave and were now holding a piece of his soul hostage. He closed the locket with a sharp click, the sound unnaturally loud in the dead air. The silver felt cold against his skin, a shard of ice in the furnace of the desert. He stood up, his movements, stiff, his face a mask of stone that betrayed none of the chaos raging within. He was no longer just a marshal investigating a crime. He was a man whose deepest wound had been ripped open, and he would follow the trail of this locket into the very heart of hell to find the man responsible. Miller. Jake said, his voice a low growl that cut through the silence. Get these people back to town. Find the undertaker. He slid the locket into his vest pocket where it rested against his chest like a cold silver heart. I'm going to find the men who did this, and I'm going to find out how they got this. He swung himself back onto Dust Devil, his focus narrowing to a single burning point. The trail was already growing cold, but it didn't matter. This was no longer about the law. It was about Sarah, and the ghost who had just declared war on him. The town of redemption was aptly named for it. Seemed every soul within its dusty borders was seeking some form of it. It was a hard-scrabble collection of clapboard buildings, baking under the relentless sun, a place where hope and desperation drank at the same saloon. The air in Sheriff Elias Vance's office was thick with the smell of stale coffee, old paper, and the weary resignation of a man who had seen too much. Elias, with his weathered face and tired blue eyes, looked up from his paperwork as Jake entered. He was more than a sheriff. He was Jake's mentor, the man who had handed him his marshal's star and taught him that the law was as much about patience as it was about a quick draw. Found you, Elias said, his voice a gravelly rumble. Miller looked like he'd seen a ghost. Jake didn't waste words. He walked to the sheriff's desk and placed the silver locket on the worn surface of the wood. It gleamed under the lamplight, a delicate, impossible object in a room built on harsh realities. Elias picked it up, his thick fingers surprisingly gentle. He turned it over, studying the engravings. Pretty thing. Too fine for a homesteader. He looked at Jake, his eyes narrowing. You look like you've been kicked by a mule. What is it? It was Sarah's. Jake said the words, feeling like shards of glass in his throat. I buried it with her. The air in the room grew heavy. Elias's folksy demeanor vanished, replaced by the sharp focus of a lifelong lawman smelling a trap. He set the locket down carefully, as if it might explode. Are you sure? I bought it for her in St. Louis. I'd know it anywhere. Jake's hand unconsciously went to his vest pocket, feeling for the phantom weight of the locket. They left it there for me to find Elias. This wasn't just a robbery. No, Elias agreed, leaning back in his chair, which groaned in protest. A man who does this ain't after gold. He's after something else entirely. Something personal. He stroked his graying beard, his mind sifting through the dark catalog of outlaws and killers he'd encountered over 40 years. We've had a string of these raids. All of them brutal, more violent than they need to be. The few who've survived call the leader the Vulture. Say he circles his prey talks like a damn preacher reading from a book of fire and brimstone before he strikes. The Vulture. The name felt right. A creature that fed on the dead and dying. Has anyone gotten a good look at him? Always masked or in the shadows. But they all say the same thing about his voice. Educated, calm, like he's enjoying himself. And there's something else. Elias hesitated. A few weeks back, he hit a supply wagon heading for the Montoya Ranch. One of the drivers lived long enough to talk. Said the leader was humming some tune, a little melody like from a music box. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, snaked its way up Jake's spine. What tune? He couldn't name it. just that it was soft out of place in all that violence. Jake's mind flashed back to a warm summer evening years ago. He and Sarah sitting on the porch of their small home watching the fireflies. She was humming a lullaby her mother used to sing to her, a simple, sweet melody. A melody he hadn't heard since she died. He pushed the thought away. It was a coincidence. It had to be. His grief was making him see patterns where there were none. But the locket was no coincidence. The Montoya Ranch, Jake said, forcing his mind back to the present. They were the target. Big target, Elias confirmed. Old man Montoya owns half this valley. He's been buying up smaller homesteads, consolidating his power. Made a lot of enemies. But this vulture, this feels different than a land dispute. This feels like a reckoning. Just then, the office door swung open, and a young woman strode in, her face set with a fiery determination that seemed to defy the oppressive heat. She was Isabella Montoya, daughter of the valley's most powerful rancher. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and her riding dress, though dusty, was of fine make. She possessed an air of authority that few men in Redemption could match. "Sheriff," she said, her voice clear and cutting, ignoring Jake completely. "I heard about the stagecoach. My father sent me. He wants to know what you're doing to stop this madman before he burns our ranch to the ground." Elias sighed. "Isabella, this is U.S. Marshal Jake Rawlins. He's taking lead on this." Isabella's dark eyes turned to Jake, and he saw no fear in them, only anger and impatience. "Marshal, while the law deliberates, my father's men are being picked off one by one. This vulture is toying with us. He leaves messages, strange biblical verses tied to our fence posts. He's not a common thief. He's a zealot." Jake met her gaze, his own expression unreadable. "I understand your concern, Miss Montoya. I need to speak with the driver who survived the attack on your wagon." "He died 2 days ago," she shot back, her tone sharp. "But before he did, he told me something. He said the leader didn't seem to care about the supplies. He just kept asking questions. Strange questions." "What kind of questions?" Jake asked, a knot tightening in his stomach. Isabella's expression softened for a fraction of a second, a flicker of confusion crossing her features. "He asked about you, Marshal. He asked the driver if Marshal Rawlins was still a man who believed in ghosts." The room fell silent once more. The locket on the desk seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. This wasn't just a message. It was an invitation. The vulture knew his name. He knew his past. And he was deliberately, cruelly luring Jake into a game where the rules were written in blood and memory. A game Jake knew he had to play, because the ghost at the center of it was his own. The days that followed were a blur of grim routine and simmering obsession. Jake rode out from Redemption at dawn and returned after dusk, chasing shadows and whispers. He revisited the scene of the massacre, walking the ground, until he knew every rock and cactus, searching for a sign, a footprint, anything the killers might have left behind. He found nothing but the lingering stain of violence. He interviewed anyone who might have seen something. A prospector in the hills described a group of riders moving fast at twilight, their faces obscured by dust and shadow. A frightened homesteader's wife spoke of a tall man who had stopped for water 2 days before the robbery, a man whose voice was smooth as a snake's belly and whose eyes seemed to look right through her. Every lead was a dead end, every trail a ghost, yet the vulture's presence was everywhere. It was in the hushed conversations in the saloon, the nervous glances from shopkeepers, the way mothers pulled their children closer when a stranger rode into town. Fear had become the valley's most abundant crop. The locket remained in Jake's vest pocket, a constant cold reminder. He found himself tracing its engravings through the fabric, his mind lost in a haze of memory. He saw Sarah's smile as he fastened it around her neck. He heard her laughter, a sound that had once been the bedrock of his world. Now these memories were tainted, twisted into weapons being used against him. He was a man haunted, and the ghost wore his wife's face. One evening, unable to face the suffocating silence of his empty house, he went to the saloon. The place was subdued, the usual boisterous energy replaced by a low murmur of anxiety. He took a whiskey at the bar, letting the burn of it anchor him to the present. "Another one?" Marshall the bartender asked, wiping the counter with a stained rag. Jake shook his head. He wasn't here to drink. He was here to listen. "Left it right on the main gatepost of the Montoya place," a ranch hand was saying at a nearby table. "A dead vulture nailed to the wood." And another one of them notes. Jake pushed himself away from the bar and walked over. What did the note say? The men looked up startled. Marshall, one of them, stammered. It was strange. Bible stuff. Something about the wages of sin and the brother's keeper. A brother's keeper. The phrase hung in the stale air. It was a common enough saying, but coupled with everything else, it felt like another key turning in a lock deep inside him. Sarah had a brother. An older brother, Silas Roberts. He was a quiet, intense man. A scholar who had disapproved of Sarah marrying a lawman, a man whose life was defined by danger. Jake hadn't seen or heard from him since the funeral. Silas had stood by the graveside, his face a mask of cold fury, and had left without saying a word. Jake left the saloon, the pieces of the puzzle swirling in his mind, forming a picture so monstrous he couldn't bring himself to look at it directly. He went to his office, lit a lamp, and unlocked the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside was a small wooden box containing the few things of Sarah's he couldn't bear to part with. A pressed flower from their wedding day, a ribbon from her hair, and a stack of letters tied with a faded blue string. His hands shook as he untied the ribbon. He sifted through the letters, his eyes scanning her elegant script. Most were from her family back east. Then he found it. A letter from Silas dated 2 years ago. He unfolded the brittle paper. Dearest sister. It began. I worry for you. That man you married lives with death as his constant shadow, and I fear that shadow will one day fall upon you. I pray you see reason and leave that God-forsaken land. He cannot protect you from the world he inhabits. Jake's eyes scanned further, his heart pounding in his chest. At the bottom of the page, Silas had written about their childhood, a shared memory. I still hum Mother's old lullaby when I am troubled. Do you remember it? It always brought us peace. The music box tune. The cold dread from Elias's office returned this time with the force of a physical blow. It couldn't be. Silas was a scholar, a man of books, not guns. He was quiet, resentful, but not a killer. A man couldn't change that much. Could he? Suddenly, a commotion from the street shattered the silence. Shouts followed by the sound of splintering wood. Jake grabbed his gun belt and rushed outside. A crowd was gathering in front of the Montoya town office. The door had been kicked in. Isabella Montoya stood in the doorway, her face pale but her eyes blazing with fury. She held up a piece of paper. He was here, she announced, her voice ringing with defiance. In the heart of your town, Marshall. He left another message. Jake pushed through the crowd and took the note from her. It wasn't a Bible verse this time. It was a single, chilling sentence written in a precise, elegant hand. A lawman's love is a grave waiting to be filled. Ask your marshal. He knows. The words were a direct assault aimed at the core of his grief and his guilt. The vulture Silas, whoever he was, wasn't just attacking the town anymore. He was openly mocking Jake, taunting him with the intimate details of his deepest pain. The game had escalated. The phantom tormentor had stepped out of the shadows, and he was calling Jake out for a final terrible confrontation. This wasn't about land or money or revenge against the Montoyas. It had always been about him and Sarah. The revelation that Silas Kane, or Silas Roberts as Jake now believed him to be, was the architect of this terror settled over him like a shroud. The world had tilted on its axis. Every memory of Sarah was now intertwined with the image of her brother, his face twisted by a grief that had festered into monstrous vengeance. The vulture wasn't just a name. It was a transformation. A scholar had buried himself, and a predator had clawed its way out of the grave. Jake knew he couldn't keep this to himself any longer. He found Sheriff Vance at the telegraph office trying to get a message to the territorial capital about the escalating violence. "It's him," Elias Jake said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. He laid out the evidence, the locket, the hummed lullaby, Silas's disapproval of their marriage, and the final taunting note. Vance listened, his weathered face growing grimmer with each word. He didn't dismiss it as the ramblings of a grieving man. He saw the cold, hard logic in the madness. A man can be eaten alive by grief, Jake. It can turn him into something you wouldn't recognize. He ran a hand over his face. So his whole war on Montoya. It's all a stage A way to draw you in. He's using this valley as his theater, Jake confirmed. And he wants me in the front row for the final act. Their conversation was cut short by the frantic arrival of one of the Montoya ranch hands. "He's hit the south pasture camp," the man gasped, covered in dust and sweat. "Killed the foreman, set the bunkhouse on fire. They're driving off the cattle." It was a classic outlaw maneuver designed to draw the law away from the main prize. But Jake saw the deeper design. "It's a feint, Elias. He's trying to pull us out of town. The real target is the ranch, or Isabella." Isabella. She had made herself a symbol of defiance against the vulture, a rallying point for the frightened townsfolk. To break her would be to break the valley's spirit. For Silas, it would be another blow against Jake, proving he couldn't protect anyone. "Miller, ride with the posse to the south pasture," Elias commanded, his voice sharp with authority. "Make a lot of noise. Make them think we're all coming. Marshal, you and I are going to the Montoya ranch. We'll use the canyon cutoff. We might just beat them there." The ride was a frantic, desperate race against time. The sun beat down, and the air was thick with the dust of their passage. Jake rode with a singular focus, the landscape blurring around him. He wasn't just riding to save Isabella Montoya. He was riding to confront a ghost from his past, a man who wore his brother-in-law's face. They arrived at the ridge overlooking the Montoya homestead to see their worst fears realized. A half-dozen riders were storming the main house, their rifles cracking in the afternoon stillness. But this was no chaotic raid. They moved with a disciplined precision, their goal clearly not plunder, but capture. "They're trying to flush her out," Jake yelled over the sound of gunfire. "Elias, take the men on the left. I'll circle around the stables and come up behind them." Jake spurred Dust Devil into a gallop, circling wide to stay out of the line of fire. He dismounted behind the stables, the smell of hay and nervous horses thick in the air. He drew his Colt, its weight a familiar comfort in his hand. He moved like a wraith through the shadows, every sense alive. He saw two of Kane's men trying to break down the heavy oak door of the main house. He took aim. He drew. Fired. The first man fell. Fired again. The second crumpled beside him. The shots alerted the others. A rifle blast splintered the wood of the stable wall next to his head. He ducked back, the sound of the bullet's passage, a high, angry whine. From the other side of the compound, he heard Elias and his men open fire, their shots adding to the cacophony. The vulture's men were caught in a crossfire. But where was their leader? Then he saw him. A tall figure emerged from the smoke of the burning bunkhouse, moving with an unnerving calm amidst the chaos. He was dressed in a long black duster, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat and a bandana. He held a pistol in one hand, but he wasn't firing. He was watching, observing his handiwork with the detached air of a director. Suddenly, a side door to the ranch house burst open. Isabella Montoya stood there, a Winchester rifle in her hands. She wasn't cowering. She was fighting. She raised the rifle and fired one of the outlaws, clutching his shoulder and falling back. It was a brave move, but a foolish one. Her position was exposed. The man in the black duster turned his movements fluid and swift. He raised his pistol not at Isabella, but at the support beam of the porch above her head. He fired once. The heavy timber cracked, splintering, and began to fall. There was no time to think. Jake broke cover running, shouting her name. Isabella. She looked up, her eyes wide with shock as the heavy beam descended. He reached her in 3 long strides, tackling her hard and throwing them both back into the doorway just as the porch roof collapsed with a deafening crash of splintering wood and thick dust. They landed in a heap inside the house, the air choked with debris. For a moment, they lay there, Jake's body shielding hers. He could feel her heart hammering against his chest. Through the haze, he saw the vulture lower his pistol, his head tilting in a gesture that might have been amusement. Then, with a signal to his remaining men, he retreated, melting back into the smoke and chaos as quickly as he had appeared. The attack was over. Jake pushed himself up, helping Isabella to her feet. She was covered in dust, a cut on her cheek, but her eyes were still blazing. "Thank you," she breathed, her voice shaky but firm. "He wasn't trying to kill you." Jake said, his gaze fixed on the spot where the vulture had stood. "He was trying to show me he could." He had saved her, but he knew with a chilling certainty that this was only a temporary victory. Silas hadn't been defeated. He had merely finished a scene in his grand play. And now he knew exactly how to hurt Jake the most. He would not target Jake directly. He would target the people Jake was sworn to protect, twisting his duty into a curse. The next time, Isabella Montoya would not be so lucky. The failed raid on the Montoya ranch left an uneasy calm over the valley. It was the quiet of a coiled rattlesnake. Silas had retreated into the hills, but his presence felt more oppressive than ever. He had tested their defenses, measured their resolve, and shown Jake that he could reach out and touch anyone he pleased. In the days that followed, an unspoken bond formed between Jake and Isabella. He spent his time at the ranch, reinforcing its defenses, organizing the ranch hands into a disciplined militia. She worked alongside him, her initial fiery impatience tempered into a cool, determined strength. She was no damsel in distress. She was a fighter, a leader, and she challenged the walls Jake had built around his heart. "You blame yourself, don't you?" she asked one evening as they stood on the rebuilt porch, watching the sun bleed across the horizon. "It's my job to protect this valley," he answered, his voice gruff. "That's not what I mean." She pressed her gaze direct. "This man, this vulture, he's not just an outlaw. He's a ghost from your past. This is happening because of you." It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact offered with a startling empathy. He found he couldn't lie to her. "His name is Silas Roberts. He was my wife's brother." He told her everything. The story spilled out of him, a torrent of grief and guilt he had held back for a year. He spoke of Sarah, of his love for her, and of the gnawing fear that his dangerous life had somehow led to her death. He told her about Silas's cold fury at the funeral, and the horrifying realization that that fury had been simmering ever since curdling into a mad obsession with revenge. Isabella listened without interruption, her expression unreadable in the twilight. When he finished, the silence was heavy with the weight of his confession. "Grief is a poison," she said softly. "It can preserve a memory or it can corrupt it. He has let it corrupt him entirely. But you, Marshall, you let it build a prison." Her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. She saw through his stoic facade to the man entombed within. For the first time since Sarah's death, he felt a crack in the ice that encased his heart. Their grim peace was shattered by the arrival of a lone rider, a young boy from a neighboring homestead. His eyes were wide with terror. He carried a leather satchel. "He sent this," the boy stammered, handing the satchel to Jake. "For the marshal." Jake's hands were steady as he opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of black cloth, was a single perfect white rose, just like the ones that grew in the garden Sarah had tended so carefully. Beneath it was a note. "The hour of judgment is at hand. I have taken what you sought to protect. If you wish to see her again, come to the old mission church beyond the Crying Squaw Peaks. Come alone. Let us end this story where it began, amongst the ruins of faith. Your brother Silas." A cold, sickening dread washed over him. He ran to the stables. Isabella's favorite mare was gone. Silas hadn't attacked the ranch again. He had been smarter. He had waited until Isabella felt safe, until she let her guard down for a solitary evening ride, and he had taken her. Damn him. Jake snarled, the sound ripped from his throat. He turned to the ranch hands gathering around him. "Saddle my horse." "You can't go alone." "Marshal," one of them protested. "It's a trap." "I know," Jake said, his voice deadly calm. He checked the cylinders of his Colt, the metallic clicks echoing in the tense silence. He was walking into a trap, but he had no choice. Silas had taken the bait, and now he was the only one who could save her. As he prepared to ride out, Elias Vance arrived, his face a mask of grim concern. "I got word. Don't do this, Jake. Let me get the posse." "There's no time, Elias." "He'll kill her," Jake said, swinging into the saddle. "This is between me and him. It always has been." He looked at the worried faces around him, Elias, the loyal ranch hands, the frightened boy. He had brought this plague upon them, but he would be the one to end it. He spurred Dust Devil into a hard gallop, heading east toward the jagged peaks that clawed at the sky. As he rode, the wind began to pick up, whipping sand into the air. The sky to the east was a bruised, sickly yellow. A sandstorm was coming. The heavens themselves were preparing for a battle. Jake rode into the growing tempest, a man racing toward a final terrible reckoning, the ghosts of his past and the fate of the woman he had to save, swirling around him like the rising dust. The journey to the old mission church was a descent into a swirling vortex of sand and memory. The world dissolved into a howling, monochromatic chaos. The wind shrieked like a banshee, tearing at Jake's clothes and flinging stinging grains of sand against his exposed skin. Dust Devil lowered its head, fighting for every step against the gale. The sun was a pale, impotent disk, obscured by the roiling yellow clouds. Jake rode on, guided by instinct and the jagged silhouette of the Crying Squaw Peaks, which appeared and disappeared in the maelstrom. The storm was a fitting backdrop for the turmoil in his own soul. Every gust of wind seemed to whisper Sarah's name. Every shadow seemed to form Silas's face. He was riding into the heart of a storm created by his own past. He finally saw it through a momentary break in the dust, a skeletal ruin perched on a windswept bluff. The mission of San Alma, the mission of the soul, had been abandoned for 50 years, its adobe walls crumbling back into the earth, from which they were made. The roof had long since collapsed, leaving only jagged ribs of timber reaching toward the sky like the bones of a desiccated carcass. It was a place where prayers had died, a perfect stage for Silas's final act. He dismounted at the base of the bluff, the wind threatening to tear the reins from his hand. He tied Dust Devil to a skeletal, lightning-scarred oak, giving the horse a final reassuring pat on the neck. "Stay, boy," he murmured. He made his way up the winding path to the church, his colt drawn, his body tensed for an ambush at every turn. The main entrance was a gaping maw, the heavy wooden doors ripped from their hinges years ago. As he stepped across the threshold, the howl of the wind outside was replaced by a different sound, a low, mournful moan as the gale forced its way through the broken stained-glass windows and the gaping holes in the walls. High above the old church bell, hanging precariously in its decaying belfry, tolled a single erratic, metallic clang, a death knell rung by the storm. Dust and sand swirled inside the nave, dancing in the dim, filtered light. At the far end, before the shattered remains of the altar, stood Silas. He was no longer the vulture, a faceless phantom in a duster. He had removed his mask. He was simply Silas Roberts, a man in a simple black coat, his face pale and drawn, his eyes burning with a righteous, incandescent fury. Isabella was there, bound to a fallen crucifix, a gag in her mouth. Her eyes were wide with fear, but even now they flashed with defiance. She was alive. That was all that mattered. "Welcome, Brother Silas," said his voice, calm and clear, cutting through the din of the storm. "I knew you would come, a man of duty to the very end. It is your most predictable and most fatal flaw." "Let her go, Silas," Jake said, his voice a low growl. He took a step forward. "This is between us." "Oh, it has always been between us," Silas replied, a thin, cruel smile touching his lips. He took a step to the side, revealing the pistol in his hand, aimed squarely at Isabella's head. "But every tragedy requires an audience, and a sacrifice. She represents everything you tried to build here, a new life on the bones of the old one. A life you built after you let Sarah die." "Sarah's death was an accident," Jake said, the words tasting like ash. Silas laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that was snatched away by the wind. "An accident? Is that the comfortable lie you tell yourself at night? There are no accidents, Marshall. Only consequences." He began to pace before the altar, his movements theatrical, rehearsed. "I warned her. I begged her to leave you. Your world is soaked in blood. I knew it would eventually stain her. And I was right." The main plot twist was about to be revealed. "What are you talking about?" Jake demanded, his mind reeling. "She was leaving you." Jake Silas hissed, his voice cracking with a year of repressed grief and rage. "That morning, she had her bags packed. She was afraid, not of outlaws or gunslingers. She was afraid of the man you were becoming. The cold, empty man who brought his work home in the silence of his eyes. She was coming to me." The words hit Jake harder than any bullet. Sarah. Leaving him, it was impossible. They had been happy, hadn't they? Or had he been so lost in his world of duty that he had failed to see the truth in his own home? "I found her on the trail," Silas continued, his eyes glazing over with the memory. "I tried to reason with her, to convince her to come with me immediately. We argued. She said she needed to tell you herself to say goodbye." He gestured wildly with his free hand. "She wouldn't listen. She turned her horse back toward the ravine, back toward you. I grabbed for the reins and the horse shied. She fell." The secondary twist, darker and more complex, was now laid bare. It wasn't a simple accident. It wasn't a clean story of a grieving brother seeking vengeance. It was a messy, tragic confluence of fear, anger, and a fatal mistake. You see, Silas whispered, his sanity fraying before Jake's eyes. If you hadn't been who you are, she would never have been on that trail. She would never have been afraid. She would still be alive. My grief has shown me the truth, Jake. You killed her as surely as if you had pushed her yourself. His grief had twisted the memory, sculpting it into a narrative that made Jake the sole villain, absolving Silas of his own role in the tragedy. He had orchestrated this entire campaign of terror, not just for revenge, but to prove a truth that existed only in his shattered mind. The church groaned around them as a particularly violent gust of wind tore at the ancient structure. The bell tolled again, a frantic, desperate clang. It ends now, Silas, Jake said, raising his Colt. Yes. Silas agreed, his eyes shining with feverish light. He pressed the barrel of his pistol against Isabella's temple. It does. In that split second, everything narrowed. The roaring wind, the crumbling church, and the years of pain and guilt. Isabella squeezed her eyes shut. Jake saw the flicker of Silas's finger on the trigger. He drew, fired. The shot was deafening. Silas staggered back, a look of pure shock on his face, a dark stain blossoming on his chest. His finger clenched in a final spastic reflex. His gun went off, the bullet burying itself harmlessly in the adobe wall, inches from Isabella's head. Silas, Robert's scholar brother, and the vengeful vulture collapsed onto the dusty floor of the ruined mission, his quest for a twisted redemption finally over. The storm raged on, but inside the church an unnatural silence fell. Jake rushed forward, his knife flashing as he cut Isabella's bonds. She threw her arms around him, her body trembling uncontrollably. He held her, his own hands, shaking, the full devastating weight of the truth crashing down upon him. He had defeated the villain, but he had lost something far more profound, the sanctity of his own grief and the simple memory of a love he now understood. He had failed. He was alive, but the ghosts he knew would haunt him forever. As if on cue, the fury of the sandstorm began to subside. The wind's shriek softened to a mournful sigh, and the suffocating curtain of dust thinned, allowing pale, watery sunlight to filter through the holes in the mission's walls. The world outside was being washed clean. Jake gently pushed Isabella behind him, his gun still trained on the fallen form of Silas Roberts. There was no movement. The vulture's reign of terror was over, leaving behind only a quiet, broken man on a dusty floor. Jake knelt, his movements heavy with exhaustion. He felt for a pulse, but found none. Silas's eyes were open, staring blankly at the ruined ceiling, as if searching for a heaven he could never reach. The immediate threat was gone, but the emotional wreckage was immense. Jake helped Isabella to her feet, his hands steadying her. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice raw. She shook her head, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders, as if to ward off a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Only my pride," she whispered, her gaze falling on Silas. He was a man made of pain. By the time Sheriff Vance and the posse arrived, drawn by the last echoes of the gunshots, the storm had passed completely. They found Jake and Isabella standing outside the crumbling mission, silhouetted against a sky of bruised purples and soft grays. The scene inside told the whole story. The journey back to redemption was slow and somber. Silas's body was carried on a makeshift litter. No one spoke. The valley, scoured and raw from the storm, seemed to mirror the state of Jake's own soul. He had confronted his ghost and won, but the victory felt hollow, leaving an ache far deeper than simple grief. He now carried the full, painful truth about Sarah's death. She had been unhappy. She had been leaving him. His devotion to his duty had not been a source of her pride, but of her fear. He could no longer hide behind the simple, tragic story of a riding accident. He had to face his own failures as a husband, failures that had contributed to the tragedy as surely as Silas's desperate act. A week passed. The town of Redemption slowly began to heal. The Montoya Ranch was secure, the threat that had paralyzed the valley lifted. The townsfolk spoke of Marshal Rawlins as a hero, the man who had faced down the vulture alone in the storm. But Jake felt no heroism. He felt only the profound weight of understanding. He spent the week in quiet contemplation, the sharp edges of his grief softening into a dull, constant sorrow. He was no longer just mourning the woman he had lost, but the marriage he had failed to save. He was grieving the man. He had been a man so focused on the horizon that he failed to see the shadows lengthening in his own home. On the seventh day, he knew what he had to do. He rode Dust Devil out to the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the town. The air was clean, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. He stood before Sarah's grave, the simple wooden headstone bearing her name and the years of her short life. He pulled the silver locket from his pocket. He had cleaned it meticulously, polishing away the grime and blood of the stagecoach massacre until it shone. He opened it one last time, looking at the miniature of his own smiling younger face, a face from another lifetime. He didn't speak. There were no words left to say. In a single deliberate motion, he placed the locket on the wooden headstone, letting it rest against her name. This act was not about forgetting. It was about acceptance. It was about forgiving Sarah, for her fear, forgiving Silas for his madness, and hardest of all, beginning the long, arduous process of forgiving himself. He was letting go, not of her memory, but of the idealized version he had clung to, the version that had imprisoned him. He stood there for a long time, letting the gentle breeze wash over him. Then he turned to leave. At the bottom of the hill, leaning against the cemetery's simple wooden fence, Isabella Montoya was waiting for him. She didn't wave or call out. She simply stood there, a quiet, steady presence against the vast landscape. She had been through the fire with him and had seen the man behind the marshal's star. He did not rush to her. His past was not something that could be outrun or easily forgotten. But he didn't turn away either. He looked from the grave on the hill to the woman waiting below, from the closed chapter of his past to the blank, uncertain page of his future. He took a single, steady, deliberate step forward, a first move away from the ghosts and toward the promise of redemption.